This is the caveman's guide to making sauerkraut. Now, in order to make sauerkraut, you're going to need a couple things. You're going to need a mason jar. I would recommend one that's about the 4-cup standard size with a wide mouth. The reason you want a wide mouth is it's easier to press in the sauerkraut. It would just make your job much easier. You're also going to need a 2-pound cabbage, a bit of kosher salt, sea salt, whatever salt you want to use. I wouldn't recommend Himalayan pink salt because it's a lot more expensive than the rest of them. And honestly, I think the quality isn't much better. Just avoid salt with added ingredients. The next thing you're going to need is something to weigh down your fermentation, whether that's buying a fermentation weight or there's a method you can use with a plastic bag filled with water that you can place on top of your sauerkraut. And then finally, you're going to need a scale to be able to weigh out your sauerkraut, be able to get the right salt ratio. So what you're going to do first, you're going to chop up the sauerkraut, remove the core from whatever cabbage you have, and weigh that out inside of your bowl, zero it out, and then write down the number. Whatever number in grams it is, you're going to have to do 2% of that number in salt. So you're going to shred up the cabbage however you want to do it. If you're lazy, you can use like a cheese grater, or you can use a knife. That's what I prefer to use. Put that in the bowl, add whatever that number was, multiplied by 0.02. That gives you 2%. That number needs to be added in salt. This is important because it promotes the growth of the correct bacteria. Lactobacillus like the 2% solution, and that's the bacteria that you're trying to cultivate inside of the sauerkraut. There's a couple different styles of ferments. There's about 3 or 4 main different bacteria that you want in your gut. There's a lot more than that, but those are the main ones. I think Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium. There's other ones. That's not so important for this video. You want to add Lactobacillus into your ferment. This is called a lactoferment. That's any ferment that involves putting vegetables in a saltwater brine. That's going to be attracting Lactobacillus. Kimchi is also a lactoferment. So once you've added this 2% salt onto your shredded cabbage, you're going to start to massage the cabbage as much as you can. You want that salt evenly distributed, and this is going to give you a killer forearm pump. Like this thing, it's like squeezing a bowl of rice. It's going to be insane. It's going to be pretty difficult, but it's going to be worth it because then you're going to have a couple weeks, a month's worth of sauerkraut. So you're going to be squeezing this cabbage, and eventually the cell walls on the cabbage are going to start to break down. That's what the salt does to it. It's going to start to become less firm, and then water is going to start to seep out of the cabbage. You should be massaging this cabbage till it's basically at a kraut-like texture, if you know what that is. If you don't, it's going to be a little mushy. It's going to bend whenever you squeeze it. And whenever you squeeze it, there's going to be water dripping out. That should be a telltale sign that it's ready to start to pack. And then you take that cabbage and pack it into your jar. You want to leave about an inch of space. If you have extra cabbage, it shouldn't be too much if you used a 2-pound cabbage. You want to leave an inch of space because whenever the sauerkraut is fermenting, it creates a lot of bubbles. And you don't want your jar to explode, so you want a little bit of space. But you also don't want too much space. You don't want to promote the wrong bacteria with too much surface area. So once that cabbage is packed in, you might not think that the liquid would rise to the top of the jar, but you might quickly realize that you were wrong. I would take whatever bowl you were using and pour the rest of that into the jar, and the liquid should rise to the top. You shouldn't have a problem with the brine. That's what it's called. And then especially with your weight, once you place whatever weight down, let me teach you the plastic bag method real quick. Just fill a plastic bag with water. You don't even have to close it. You just fill it with water, stick it into your jar. It should leave everything nice. Take a cabbage leaf. You should peel off the excess leaves that are they look a little wilted. You don't really want those in your sauerkraut anyway, so you should have peeled those off before you cut them. You can take one of those leaves and place it on top to ensure that nothing floats to the top. And then weigh it down, and your brine should float above all of the kraut, even the leaf. And if it doesn't, you can weigh out 100 grams of water, add 2 grams of salt for the 2% brine, or you can do the calculation for 2%. Make sure that it's a 2% brine, and then you can add that on top. You want liquid to be covering everything because this is a ferment that requires 0 oxygen in order to be successful. So the golden rule for sauerkraut and any lacto ferment is if it is under the brine, it's going to be fine. And on the other hand, if it's outside of the brine, then you pose a risk of botulism, mold, some sort of weird slimy texture, or just spoilage in general, which you don't want. So you want to ensure that everything's under the brine. You want to leave an inch of space. Make sure you put that cabbage leaf on top so that no weird shreds will float to the top. And you might still be in a situation where there's some stuff floating on the top. From my experience, anything that made it to the top isn't really going to go back down. So I like to take a spoon and just scoop them out. It takes like 5 minutes. And then it's ready to sit. First, I'm going to talk about whether you should leave a loose or a tight lid on your sauerkraut. I would personally recommend a loose lid. Although you can do a tight lid, you pose the risk of your jar exploding. I personally will suggest to you check it every single day just to make sure you know what's going on with your sauerkraut. There's a bunch of different things that can happen, such as your brine could overflow, or it could do the opposite, and the cabbage could start to absorb that liquid. And you want to be knowing as soon as that happens. So make sure you're checking your sauerkraut every single day. And then keep the lid loose so that it can burp itself whenever there's CO2 buildup. If you have a mason jar, it's a little 2-part lid, and just keep that outside lid a little loose. Make sure it still covers the kraut because you don't want too much oxygen to get in. Otherwise, that just raises the risk of mold if there's anything partially touching the surface. Now let's talk about botulism. So botulism is a pretty scary thing where canners and fermenters alike have to be aware of it. It's a disease that affects about 7 people a year from foodborne botulism, and fermenters pose the risk of it. Now, the way that you can avoid botulism in sauerkraut completely is making sure that brine's at 2% salt and making sure everything is completely submerged under that brine. And then if you really want to be above and beyond, you can buy a pH tester or pH strips because botulism cannot spread below 4.6 pH, which sauerkraut, within about 2 days, that pH is going to be extremely low. It's going to be in the 4s, 3s to 4s, because the lactobacillus bacteria is acidic. That's why it's called sauerkraut. It becomes very acidic and botulism just can't spread. So sauerkraut is typically very safe as long as you do it in the right way. Now, the reason botulism is a really big risk for canning, and the reason I think it's not so risky for fermenting, is whenever you can stuff, you have to boil the can to make sure there's no yeast inside of it. That's part of the canning process, yeast or bad bacteria. So you want to boil it to kill all that stuff. But the problem is the botulism bacteria are extremely resilient. So it turns out you'll boil everything else, and then botulism will remain, and it becomes very dangerous. So canning is a lot riskier for botulism, in my opinion, than fermenting. There's not very many documented cases of fermented botulism, but I would like to keep it that way. Online, I saw about 2 cases, and they were both in Japan, and it was weird stuff, like they were fermenting natto in the ground, and I don't even remember what the other one was, to be honest. But there's not a lot of documented fermented cases, and that's because the pH just gets so low. If your sauerkraut by any chance was done wrong and it does contain botulism, definitely go to the hospital. Some symptoms are droopy eyes or weak muscles, just really tired all of a sudden after eating your sauerkraut. There's some other signs too. If you think you have it, look it up. Definitely go to the doctor. But it's extremely rare. Your sauerkraut will indicate spoilage if it's got botulism. It's going to smell really bad. That doesn't automatically mean it's got botulism, but you'll be able to tell if your sauerkraut's spoiled. As long as it's done under the right conditions, sauerkraut is just going to be salty cabbage at one point and sauerkraut at another point. There's never really a time when it's unsafe unless it gets spoiled and the fermentation is wrong. This is a preservation technique. So if you're anything like me and you're worried, should I be eating this 2 days in? As long as you're following the right steps of 2% brine, keeping everything under the brine, then you're going to be okay. Now, about mold, if anything molds on top of your sauerkraut, that means the leaves were exposed to the air, which is breaking one of the rules. But it could possibly be saved. I tend to throw any mold away. Any colorful mold, any other color other than white or gray is bad. You want to just instantly throw it away. You don't want to deal with that because those molds, once it's on top, it can release spores inside, especially black mold. Absolutely, if you get any black mold, I'm sorry for your loss, but you have to get rid of your sauerkraut. Now, white and gray mold are a little different. They're not as dangerous, but I still like to throw the sauerkraut away personally. So that's what I'm going to recommend to you guys. You have your whole life to live. There's no reason to waste it being mold poisoned. Another indication of spoilage in your sauerkraut is the brine gets very slimy. And from what I know, this happens because you either don't have the 2% salt brine or everything's not submerged. This can also happen very minorly in the first 3 days of the ferment where Leucaena stock is dominant. Now, this is the first bacteria that really acidifies everything. They say botulism is killed in the first few hours because of this bacteria. Now, this bacteria ultimately ends up dying because it makes the environment too acidic. So it goes away, and then lactobacillus takes over. It makes the perfect home. It's like, I don't know how this bacteria stays alive. I'm not going to lie. Should have been naturally selected or whatever years ago. Yeah, I'm going to leave that in. So, if you get a slimy texture whenever your sauerkraut gets pulled out of the jar, maybe you're trying to eat it and it's just really slimy, throw it away. It's spoiled. I'm sorry. Another problem is, I've personally experienced this one very recently. What happens whenever your brine falls below the base level? It was submerged in brine at first, and you check it the next day, and suddenly it's reabsorbed all the brine. Now, you can try and repress it down. I've found that never really works. So the pH is lowered because of sauerkraut, and adding water will definitely raise that pH, but a little bit of salt water isn't going to raise it enough to make it risky. So that's what I'm going to prescribe to you guys. Add more of that 2% brine, especially if you're going to keep fermenting it. If you're making a couple weeks worth of a ferment and it's 4 days in and it absorbed everything, it's going to reacidify anyway. So adding that little bit of water to ensure that everything stays submerged is the way to go. Especially since it's just a tiny bit of water, it's not going to raise the pH as much as you think it is, I'm sure. Now, the opposite can happen whenever it's first fermenting. I'm just going to tell you guys that it's okay. If it overflows for any reason, that's fine. The cabbage is just releasing more juices. If it's all the way to the top, you can try pouring a little bit of the brine out. It's really up to you. I like to leave that inch of space just so that I can ensure that my jar doesn't explode. But it really shouldn't explode if it's got a loose covered lid. So if it overflows, that just means the cabbage had a lot of water content in it. Now, the temperature you're going to want your sauerkraut to ferment at is going to be 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. most houses are going to be at that temperature. I like to keep it in cooler areas. It kind of promotes the better ferment, in my opinion. So keep it in a storage cabinet just away from direct sunlight, because that's going to vary the temperature. Because if it is exposed to sun, then the temperature is definitely going to go up. Think about a car. It's the same idea. So if the temperature is too high, it's probably going to get spoiled. If the temperature is too low, I don't think it's going to ferment. 60 to 75 is just the basic. Keep it at that temperature. I think that's about everything. Let me check my notes really fast. Let's see. Okay. That's about everything. But first, I would like to talk about, what about the flavors? What about, I want to add garlic and carrots and pineapple to my sauerkraut. They say it ferments faster and I want to try it. If you're watching a basic guide for sauerkraut, then chances are you haven't made it before. And if you haven't made it before, I want to tell you, you do not deserve to be making the fancy flavors yet. You should definitely be making sauerkraut 2-3 times to ensure that you get the basic process down, and then you can start doing the flavors. This is about expanding your gut health. That's what everyone should be making sauerkraut for. Sure, if you're making it for taste, maybe try pickling it if you don't really care about the gut benefits. But you should definitely make sure that you have the process down before you add extra things. That's what I'm going to tell all of you guys. Make it once or twice before you even consider making the extra flavors. And that way you can fall in love with homemade sauerkraut. It's just going to make the process so much better for you. So definitely do not be adding carrots, pineapple, ginger, garlic to your sauerkraut the first time that you make it. And that's a big no-no. I recommend that with every ferment. If you're making kimchi, make the most bare bones kimchi recipe you can, just so that you can fall in love with the process. It makes the experience of adding flavors so much better. You have to walk before you can run. So definitely don't be making flavors on your first or second time. I would recommend, if you're starting sauerkraut for probiotics, start at a 7-day sauerkraut. That's your first goal. Once it reaches 7 days, put it in the fridge and start with a little teaspoon of the brine. My prescription used to be 3 days, but I've found that that's way too variable. And instead of sauerkraut, it's just salty cabbage. I think our bodies can handle the histamines in sauerkraut better than I originally presumed. So definitely use a 7-day sauerkraut instead of a 3-day. And just try a teaspoon a day of just the brine. And then if your gut can handle that, signs that your gut can't handle that is if you're bloated, gassy, you have diarrhea, then I'd say try a teaspoon again. Maybe it'll adapt. And if it's not, go back to a 3-day sauerkraut. Maybe you can try the brine at 3 days, see how your gut reacts, just to make sure that your gut isn't super sensitive. But I would say for most people, a 7-day sauerkraut should be fine. Start with a teaspoon of the brine, work your way up to a tablespoon, and then you can start eating the kraut. And then you'll love it. This is one of the 3 or 4 main bacteria that your gut could be lacking. This is going to fortify your gut and help prevent it from leaking, which a common idea now is that your gut leaking is what causes a lot of sickness. So happy gut, happy mind. It can also help with your skin health. My skin health is a lot better. This is my new baseline ever since I've started eating sauerkraut alone. So I'm glad you guys are trying to better your health like that. Once you get through a week of sauerkraut, maybe try a longer ferment. It'll be more lactobacillus species you'll be adapted to. Same thing with kimchi. You can try kimchi, and this is the first step in your journey. This was the sauerkraut guide. Thanks for watching. I'll leave a link if you want to donate, or at minimum, leave a comment if you made it to the end, just to boost the algorithm. Probably deserves more views than it's got if you made it all the way to the end. See you next time.